Hello, welcome to the Wise Owl, a video series featuring the faculty of the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Montevallo. I'm your host today, Scott Turner, and I'm very excited to introduce to you Professor John Bawden, who teaches history at the university. Dr. Bawden earned his PhD at the University of California, Riverside, and he is the author of two books, The Pinochet Generation, The Chilean Military in the 20th Century, and more recently, Latin American Soldiers, Armed Forces in the Region's History. But today we're going to be diving back a little further in the historical timeline to talk about the fascinating topic of the fall of Tenochtitlan. And my first question to Dr. Bawden is, am I pronouncing it correctly?
More or less.
Okay.
I think I've always heard the name of the city pronounced Tenochtitlan.
Tenochtitlan.
And on my list of to-dos is asking a speaker of Nahuatl to give a more authentic pronunciation.
Well, I'll do my best. You know what I'm talking about. But I think it's fair to say that Tenochtitlan is not exactly a household word. So my real first question to you, Dr. Bawden, John, if I may, is what in the world was Tenochtitlan?
Tenochtitlan was the imperial center of the Aztec Empire. And the Aztec Empire comes to power in Mexico's Central Valley in the south center of modern day Mexico. It's a densely populated region, and there are many individual city-states that surround a lake, Lake Texcoco. And if you go to Mexico City today, you can visit some lakes that were once a part of a much larger lake, Lake Texcoco. And an ethnic group, an individual ethnic group of people called the Mexica, which is where we get the word Mexico, came into the Valley of Mexico and this densely populated region, and they looked for a place to build their own city, and they picked an island in the middle of a large lake, Lake Texcoco. And from that lake, they began building what would become the largest city in the Americas by the time Europeans arrive. And so they began building their city, Tenochtitlan. And over the span of about 100 years, it grew to become a very large city.
So I know enough to know that Europeans, Spanish, are going to be arriving, that this is going to set the stage for the fall of Tenochtitlan. But when those Europeans arrive and they first encounter the city, what would their impression have been? How large was this city compared to what they might have been familiar with in Europe?
That's a good question. When most of the Spaniards who enter the city in November of 1519 had never seen a city so large. They had heard of cities such as Cairo and Constantinople with populations exceeding 100,000 people. But most of the people who were with Hernando Cortez, including the conqueror Hernando Cortez, had never seen a human settlement like Tenochtitlan in their lives. They'd never seen anything like it. Not only that, they had never seen a city in the middle of a lake. They had heard, some had seen the city of Venice in Italy, but they had never seen anything like this city, and its marketplace was of particular interest to them. They had never seen so many goods in one place being bought and sold. So the city, for this group of Spaniards, the largest cities they were familiar with were Seville and Madrid and Lisbon. And in these places, they would have seen 30 to 50,000 people. In Tenochtitlan, there were 200,000.
Wow. So really approaching the size of a sort of a modest city in the United States today, right? I'm also curious about what kinds of impressions the culture of the people may have made, because when I think about this, here we have really two civilizations that have developed completely independently of one another. No contact, even more so than it was more exotic to the European arrivals than than Asia would have been to Marco Polo. And I imagine this is probably the closest analogy to encountering an alien civilization from outer space, right? And so, what can you tell me about the culture of, I don't know, should I say Aztecs? What's the proper terminology?
I think that because this is a pre-national time and there's no general, if you go into Mexico 500 years ago, there's not a sense of being an Aztec, a broader sense of belonging to the Aztec nation. The Aztecs were an imperial people, numbering, the total number of Aztecs would have been about 300,000, whereas there's more than 10 million people living in modern day Mexico. And of those 10 million people, very few were Aztecs, and they don't share a sense of allegiance to each other. So that's an important thing to know about Mesoamerica at this time. But to answer your question about the exoticism of what Europeans will see when they reach the coast, when they come to Mexico, what was so unusual for them to see, and by that I mean this group of Iberians, is they find cities. They find stone-built cities, and they find organized states and classes of warriors who are formidable. They have weapons that the native people in the Caribbean do not have. And more importantly, from a Spanish perspective, these are densely populated regions. These are highly productive regions where there are agricultural economies. The people are already accustomed to paying taxes. And so they find a level of organization and a sophistication that they haven't found anywhere in the Caribbean.
So we're not just talking about a large city, we're talking about a substantial empire, right, that stretches over vast territory.
That's correct. And there was, different regions in the Aztec Empire produced different kinds of things. In the Imperial Center, we know that colorful feathers were something that elites used to adorn themselves. Well, you had to go to tropical zones in Mexico to find those colorful feathers. Or rubber, for instance, cacao, which was used to make a drink. We, of course, use it to make hot cocoa and chocolate. But those were things that weren't actually in the surrounding area where the Aztecs lived. So this is a region that's connected. It's connected by trade. There are different ecological zones, and they're all densely populated. I think that's the key thing to know, is this is a densely populated part of the world.
Okay, so the Spanish arrive, and so I'm thinking about the timeline. So there's already a European presence in the Caribbean at this point, right? But now they're arriving on mainland Mesoamerica, and so set up this first encounter for me. How does this occur?
The first encounter, the Spanish leave Cuba, and they set out with a number of ships. And what makes the expedition led by Hernando Cortez so different is its size. Many more ships, horses, cannon, and 500, crucially, there's 500 soldiers. So this expedition sets out from Cuba. There's already knowledge of civilization on the mainland. And part of what the Europeans are looking for would be a passage to the Pacific Ocean. And they kept looking for that for quite a few decades after 1519. But when they reach what is sometimes called the Maya Riviera, they make contact with native peoples who have said are numerous, who are able to defend themselves effectively. And that's not often sometimes the image we have of Spaniards encountering native peoples. we tend to think that the Spanish had a preponderance of military power. And in many of these early engagements, it's the Europeans who are having a hard time protecting themselves. So that's one thing that's important to know about these expeditions into Mesoamerica, is it doesn't go very well in many cases. Now, what does happen to Cortez and his expedition is early on, he's moving along the coast, and he's able to win a battle and make peace with a group of native peoples. And they, in fact, will give him a translator. They will give him a young girl who can speak 2 of the major languages in the region. And he finds a shipwrecked Spaniard who has been living in the region for a number of years and has learned Maya, which is not the language of the Aztecs. But so he winds up learning more about the region, but he also picks up a few translators. And then he goes to what is today Veracruz, which is on the coast. And that's when he begins to learn more about the Aztec Empire. He learns about regions of Mesoamerica who are subject to Tenochtitlan, and they do not like being ruled by Tenochtitlan. And so what's happening in 1519 is this group of Spaniards is learning that there are people unhappy with the Aztec Empire, and they're also gaining assets that will become important as they move inland.
All right, and you mentioned looking for the Pacific. I assume this is like hopefully to open up like a more efficient shipping route. I guess they're still trying to get to Asia, right? Basically.
Correct.
And what else, is that the only thing? Is there anything else that's making them tick? What are the Spaniards looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Spanish are looking for a number of things. We mentioned the passage to the Pacific Ocean. Ultimately, what they find is the Pacific coast of Mexico, ultimately, and a port is established at Acapulco. And from Acapulco, the Spanish will send 2 ships every year to the Philippines and the city of Manila, and they will trade with China. So ultimately, Mexico does provide one thing that the Spanish greatly want. Another thing that they're looking for, and this is paramount, is gold. The people who are coming to Mexico, the Iberians coming to Mexico, are not professional soldiers. They're not getting a salary from the King of Spain. And so they're expected to give 20% of whatever gold, whatever riches they are able to accumulate to the crown, but they can keep what's left over. And so they are eager and motivated to find precious metals. And then finally, there are always priests. There are always Franciscans and then Jesuits that are accompanying these groups of Spaniards. And they're keeping an eye on what the Spanish do to ensure the crown gets its cut, its 20% of riches. But they're keen to establish churches and a missionary presence in the region. So gold, the Spanish are looking to make Christians out of the people whenever they can. They're looking for gold. They're looking for a passageway to Asia. And then ultimately, they're looking for conquest. They're looking for the ability to take possession of territory and to rule over subject peoples themselves.
Okay, so you already indicated that they're in the hinterland. They're finding sort of willing allies who aren't very happy with Aztec rule, right? Okay, so then take us up to, the direct encounter with Tenochtitlan. How's that happen? How's that go?
There's a few things to point out as the Spanish begin marching towards this great center. First, the native peoples that they talk to through translators say there is a great city, a powerful city, a fortified city, and you don't want to go there because the people who live there are powerful and they're great warriors. And so Cortez during this time is moving cautiously, you could say, and he eventually encounters a confederation of people. They're called the Tlaxcalans, and this is a loose confederation of ethnically similar people who are not conquered by the Aztecs, and don't see the Aztecs as any party they want to make common cause with in a fight against the Spanish. And this is a very significant moment. So the Spanish reach the Tlaxcalan Confederation. Initially, there's warfare, and then the chiefs of Tlaxcala make an alliance with the Spanish. And from this point forward, anywhere the Spanish go, they have indigenous allies with them who are instrumental to everything else that happens. So that's one important moment that really sets up a lot of other important turning points. Then the Spanish reach a very large city called Cholula, and important things happen there, which I won't outline except to say they capture the city. Their allies loot the city, and word of this gets back to Tenochtitlan, and it becomes obvious that the Spanish are posing a threat of some kind. The leader of Tenochtitlan isn't sure what to do. That's a crucial point to make. He's not sure. These are strange alien invaders, and there's a lot of speculation about the thinking and the thought process of the Aztec aristocracy, and in particular the emperor, Montezuma. Many people have heard that name, Montezuma. Montezuma is not sure what to do as this Spanish Tlaxcalan force is marching towards his city. And that sets up an encounter in November of 1519, where the Spanish show up on the shores of Lake Texcoco, and they really demand permission to enter the city. And Montezuma, the most powerful man in Mesoamerica, allows them to enter the city.
And so with this demand, are they entering at this point as an invading force, or are they presenting themselves as just visiting foreigners?
Yes, that's a good question. Throughout this time, Cortez had been sending messages that he comes from a faraway land and represents a great lord. And he's referring to Charles V, the King of Spain and of the Holy Roman Empire. And he says, I have a message for you from Charles V. And I am not a great lord. I represent a great lord. And I've come to tell you about my religion. In a nutshell, he says, I've come in peace, and I have a message for you. Montezuma isn't sure what to make of this man that he's about to encounter. And so he allows him into the city and gives him quarters, he and his men, along with some of his allies. Now, Montezuma and the Aztecs explain, you don't want to trust the Tlaxcalans. They're not your friends. So it's a very it's very unstable. It's unclear exactly what's going to happen when the Spanish first come into the city.
Okay. Now, let me ask you, you mentioned religion. The Spaniards have priests with them. So, I want to put out an image I have of Aztec religion, and you can either confirm it or disabuse me of my errors. So my image is a kind of priestly aristocracy that demands tribute of human sacrifices from the subjects of the Aztec Empire. And the nature of those human sacrifices is like physically plucking the hearts out of the chests. So how accurate is that impression?
Yes, it's very important to the Spanish in their accounts of everything that happened to emphasize the existence of human sacrifice, because for them, this is a great justification of everything they do. And everything that they do that is of questionable morality, they say, well, it was for the greater cause of converting these heathen and brutal people to Christianity, the one true faith. So yes, indeed, they do encounter people who practice human sacrifice, and the Aztecs were known throughout Mesoamerica to practice human sacrifice on a scale that was unknown prior to the rise of this imperial state. And the Aztecs believed in part that the sacrifices they were doing were a reason for the success of the empire. And they expected tribute from their client states and their subject states in the form of human sacrificial victims. And these ceremonies would take place at the top of pyramids with many steps, and hearts would be removed from victims' chests. And this was a part of the local religion. So that is a part of the story. Now, you have to be careful when you read Spanish sources because they often will exaggerate the number of sacrifices. They put an emphasis always on its occurrence because for them, it's why they are justified in doing anything else they do.
Mm-hmm. So in my sunroom, I have a little round stone sun with a face, right, that I bought at a souvenir shop. Do the Aztecs worship the sun? Is that an accurate understanding of their religion?
The Aztecs are a polytheistic people, and you want a good way to think of it is they're a polytheistic people. They do have gods that correspond to the sun and the moon and rain and maize, but they also have patron gods. And the god of war is very important in their pantheon. And the Aztecs were a martial people with a great militaristic ethos. And so Huichilobos, the god of war, was especially important in their pantheon, and they would sacrifice to this god before engaging enemies in battle, to give you an example.
All
so,
right.
No,
so
they don't worship the sun. I think you're actually thinking of the Incas in South America,
oh,
where
maybe
there
I am.
was a cult of worshiping Inti, the sun god, and the Incas, the emperors there in South America of a very different imperial state were believed to be descendants of the sun.
Well, thanks for that correction. All of this time, I thought I had an Aztec sun hanging on my wall. So let's, need to make a long story short, and this is a long story. I know that there's so much to delve into, but how did things come to a head? How did Tenochtitlan fall?
And there's a few important points to make on what happens to the city. I told you that the Spanish are first welcomed into the city. Within 2 months, Aztec nobles are beginning to talk about expelling them from the city. Famously, the Spanish move around the city. They write very evocative descriptions of the city's marketplace, its zoo. There was a zoo in Tenochtitlan. They also visit temples, and they insult the state religion, and they declare that the gods of the Aztecs are false gods. They're wicked, they're demonic, and in fact, the Aztecs and all other people should be worshiping the same god as the Spanish. So tensions are developing, and then something very important happens, which is the Spanish attack a group of Aztec priests and dancers who are celebrating a religious festival. The Spanish believe that the Aztecs are preparing an attack. The Aztecs later will claim in their accounts of what happened that it was an unprovoked attack. But the point is that Spaniards attack a group of religious authorities, would be one way to put it. And at that point, the two camps are now preparing to, for a full-scale war. At this point, the Spanish have captured Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, and are holding him hostage. To give you some idea of the tensions in the city, the Aztecs begin preparing to elect a new emperor who will lead them in battle against the Spanish. And it erupts in July of 1520. And the two sides begin attacking each other. The Spanish are forced out of the city. Most of them die. Most of them are either killed or drowned, and they're forced out of the capital, and they escape with their Tlaxcalan allies, their indigenous allies, and they're pursued until a plain in the Valley of Mexico, and barely escape. A very reduced number of Spaniards and Tlaxcalans escape, and they return to Tlaxcala, which is where the Spanish have allies. And at this point, the Aztecs really feel like they have the Spanish on the run. They have their enemies, the Tlaxcalans, on the run. And all they have to do now is fortify their alliances and they'll be able to beat back any future attempts to enter the city. They know who the Spanish are. They understand their intentions. And so from a certain perspective, in August of 1520, things are moving in the right direction until there's a smallpox outbreak in the capital. And this is truly one of the most important turning points in the entire story, because the whole city is stricken and people don't know what's happening. You can use your imagination. They're crying out to their gods. Many people die. Many people are weakened. And so, meanwhile, the Spanish are not affected by this smallpox outbreak, and most of their allies did not live in large cities. And contagious disease, of course, these are airborne diseases, don't spread as quickly in rural areas. So the Spanish and their allies aren't nearly as affected by this first epidemic. Then the Spanish are reinforced from the coast. They fortify their alliances. They make promises to Indian allies, as they were called at the time. And they promised tax exemptions and other privileges to the Tlaxcalans and others that would help them. And then they returned to the city, and they were able to flip an important ally of the Aztecs, a city that was a part of the Aztec alliance. And from that city, they cut the water supply to Tenochtitlan. There was an aqueduct moving fresh water into Tenochtitlan. And then they began launching an amphibious assault. And the siege of Tenochtitlan lasted over a month. Ultimately, the Spanish enter the city with their allies, and the combat ensues. It's hand to hand, and they eventually capture the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtemoc, and the city falls in August of 1521, 500 years ago.
Wow. I'm curious, in the midst of the catastrophic smallpox epidemic, did the Aztec emperor describe it as a hoax and predict that it would just go away by April, by any chance?
I have a story about that. The Aztec emperor at the time, Cuauhtemoc, died of smallpox. So the most powerful man in Tenochtitlan died of plague. And you can imagine the confusion that this event was sowing within the ranks. But no, there was no talk of a hoax. It was very real, and we can assume that people were offering sacrifices to the gods. We can assume that people were trying to understand what was happening. What we do know is they certainly fought with every ounce of strength remaining in the city when the Spanish returned.
So this devastates, destroys one political empire, right? And it paves the way for the Spanish to move in and set up their domain.
That's correct.
But the people, lots of people die, but not everyone dies, right? So I'm curious about the legacy. Are there direct descendants of Aztecs alive today? Are there remnants of the culture that still, influence, say, Mexican society today?
Yes, the legacies are many, and I'll begin by saying that millions of Mexicans, contemporary Mexicans, speak the languages spoken 500 years ago. That is to say, primarily Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztec Empire, and Maya, which was another language family the Spanish encountered during this time I was talking about. These are two languages spoken by millions of people in Mexico, contemporary Mexico. So the languages haven't gone away. The cities that I've talked about with you are still around. Tenochtitlan is now Mexico City, but if you go to the center of Tenochtitlan, you'll find a great Roman Catholic cathedral. Next to it are the ruins, the visible ruins of the Aztec temple, the Templo Mayor. So you can go to modern Mexico and you can see the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish built their capital, their imperial capital, right on top of the old city, and they drained much of the lake, but you can still go to a large lake in Mexico City, Lake Xochimilco, and you can see what the lake, the brackish waters would have looked like. In fact, you can go and see beds of crops that the Aztecs would have used in their time in an agricultural practice that they had. So you can go to Mexico, you can visit the city of Tlaxcala. So if you want to go to Tlaxcala City, you can, where the descendants of the Tlaxcalans I mentioned are still living. How many people have descendants from the Mexica in modern Mexico? Well, it would be less than 10% of modern Mexicans are, have, a direct connection to the Aztec people, the Mexica. But very much so, the iconography of the city, very much so is a part of modern Mexico. The languages that were spoken 500 years ago are still spoken. And the aesthetics, you talk about there was a tradition of using calendars in the Mesoamerican world. And if you go to any handicrafts market in Mexico, you'll see those traditional calendars. The style of illustrating and producing textiles, dyeing textiles, all of those things remain in Mexico. So there's a very long legacy from this period to the present.
So in Mexico today, is there a similar kind of reckoning going on as we see in the United States in terms of how this is taught, how we commemorate it? Because, I think it's fair to say that until fairly recent times, this is a story that, was taught in public schools almost exclusively from a settler standpoint, right? And, you might get a footnote on the indigenous culture and their point of view. So I know there's a lot, there's been a lot of reevaluating how we tell this story. Is that happening in Mexico as well? And what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, it's been happening in Mexico for the last 100 years, is the best way to put it. Up until really the start of the 20th century, the view of Cortez and the Spanish arrival was positive in the sense that Cortez was bringing Christianity, and that was a good thing for Mexico. I would not say that Cortez was viewed as a hero to the Mexican people, but the process was something that was destined to occur and was a good thing in the arrival of Christianity. Well, after the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910, there was a reevaluation of this story, and there was a new emphasis placed on the Aztec emperors as symbols of, a sovereign Mexico. Cuauhtemoc, who is the last Aztec emperor, that's a common name now in Mexico, and celebrating the culture of the Aztecs now is commonplace. The national soccer team, they go by the Aztecs. So these are all new developments of celebrating the indigenous pre-Columbian elements. Furthermore, I would mention that in Mexico by the 1960s, you had a whole generation of ethnolinguists who learned the languages, the indigenous. So these are people of Hispanic culture who went and learned the indigenous languages and began translating documents from Maya and Nahuatl into Spanish so they could be understood. A book came out called Vision of the Vanquished. It's also sometimes called The Broken Spears, but it's a collection from codices and writings made by indigenous people about what happened. So it presents an indigenous point of view about the conquest. And so that's been happening in Mexico really since the 60s, and it continues into the present. There's a great interest in archaeology. So in the past, there was some archaeology that occurred in the 20th century, but ever more so, Mexico wants to preserve its pre-Columbian heritage, and it puts money behind excavations, scholarly production related to the First Nations, the indigenous cultures of Mexico. So it's a very different Mexico today than it was 100 years ago.
Well, John, it's been super interesting, and I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that our viewers have as well. So I want to thank you very much for your knowledge and perspective.
Well, I've had fun talking to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Sure.